Welcome back to Juice's Arthropods. My name is Juice, and today we're going to talk about the long-awaited care guide for the Pterinochilus murinus, or the Orange Bitey Thing, aka the Orange Baboon Tarantula. The OBT, or Orange Baboon Tarantula, which, as you might imagine, I'm just going to call it OBT going forward, is an incredible, in my opinion, old-world tarantula that is every bit as awesome as it is beautiful. This tarantula, though, because of our new format where we're going to go over a couple more things in our standard format, is going to be kind of complicated because of course we didn't make this easy for us. So let's talk first about distribution range for this tarantula. Now, here's the funny thing about this. If you look up the distribution range for the OBT, it says Angola, Tanzania, East and middle, or central rather, southwest and southeast Africa. Now, I want you to look at a map right now. Basically what they're saying is everything under what used to be Congo or the DRC is now their entire range. However, what they're talking about is there's multiple color forms of these guys ranging, I mean, you can see them, RCF and all of these other things. We're talking about the Pterinochilus murinus in perpetuity. I am not going to break this guide up into specific things such as Usambara in different color forms, okay? So this is crucial to notate that I am not doing it to any one particular except for the generic color form of the OBT. Let's first talk about diet. Diet, like with all other tarantulas, is going to be restricted to your location's feeders, okay? If you are watching this and you're in the United Kingdom, well, I can't really help you with some of your available feeders. All I can talk about are the feeders that we have here in the United States. Everything ranging from dubia roaches, crickets, waxworms, black soldier fly larvae, as long as the size of the meal doesn't exceed their actual abdomen size. Like, honestly, if these guys are looking real big, real thick, don't feed them. But any feeder that you can find from a traditional pet store or online in the United States is perfect. Do not feed these live mammals. I see people do this, and this is insane, guys. You are talking about handing something that has teeth and is going to fight back to your precious pet. I don't even care if it's a frozen pinky. There's really no point to do that for this particular species because they're not really that big. So at the end of the day, I would just stick to invertebrates at the end of the day. There's really no reason to spend the money on pinkies or fuzzies or anything like that. Just feed them dubia roaches or crickets and you'll be totally fine. So what should you do for enclosure setup? Hey, so Look, I know, I look totally different than the rest of the video. I'm actually Juiced from the future. This is important, okay? I'm about to tell you guys some information because in the last time when I filmed this, which was what feels like forever ago, I gave some incorrect information. And I am so absolutely obsessed with giving you the correct information. I'm now going to correct myself before I put this video out. So do I look great? No. Do I look insane? Absolutely. Let's talk about care. There's a couple things to notice, or to know rather, about care and enclosure setup that is very important about the OBT, okay? That is, everybody on the internet is doing something called SEO, or whatever that stands, search engine optimization, all right? So what ultimately happens is that one person who's especially famous will come out and say that this tarantula is blank, and then every other person on the planet doesn't know better, so they just copy it. An OBT is what you would call a terrestrial tarantula, but tends to be an obligate burrower. Words like semi-fossorial and semi-arboreal are silly, so let's make things very simple before we move forward. There is no such thing as a semi-arboreal species. All that means is that iNaturalist or someone that saw them in the wild happened to see one in a tree one day. Tarantulas will follow food anywhere, okay? That'd be like saying that like human beings are semi-arboreal because we climbed into a tree once to grab apples. It doesn't matter. They're not. You can tell this by looking at their abdomen. You can look at all of the things about them and see very quickly that they are not a fossorial, or specifically a fossorial tarantula. It does not matter how big the person is that you saw this information about. Things change with new data. And one of the things that's important is that they are not a fossorial. They're a terrestrial tarantula that is an obligate burrower. Such as the GBB is not a semi-arboreal, the OBT is not semi-fossorial. Do we understand this? Perfect. Why is this important? Because too often people are keeping them in a ton of substrate depth, and it's not necessary, and it actually just means you'll never see your OBT. So I recommend a terrestrial enclosure with a regular terrestrial amount of soil. If you want to give them more depth, you totally can by giving them a sloping gradient. That's totally fine, but it's not necessary to put them in a fossorial enclosure. Why is this important, you might ask? Well, as we stated somewhere else in this video, I'm sure, they're very fast. And even in a, say, 12-inch cube, guess what they can clear pretty quickly? A 12-inch cube. So why do you want something that you can go as wide as you want? You can go as big as you want. Just keep the ceiling depth small. Keep them in a terrestrial type enclosure. They'll do totally fine. I do keep a decent amount of substrate, so typical rule of thumb is if you know the spider is going to get 6 inches, have some good depth to it. But at the end of the day, treat them like you would anything else that is a terrestrial obligate burrower, such as an Aphonopelma. You'll be totally fine treating them this way. So I use a terrestrial enclosure, and I make sure that they have plenty of soil depth. Now, as you get them as slings, they will tend to be more, especially in the wild, they tend to be more of a fossorial style tarantula. And I think this is where the confusion really lies. They will dig very deep down. And then as they get older and they get a little bit more comfortable with themselves, they will wander a little bit more across the terrain. So I hope this helps. Get a terrestrial and put some soil in it, and they'll be totally fine. It's an OBT. They also tend to like it more arid, with a little bit of humidity is totally fine. A lot of where the commonality of misunderstanding comes into is that the slings do tend to be found under the soil, especially under the underbrush in the wild. But as they become bolder and older and are less afraid of the birds and other creatures trying to eat them, and they become the amazing and incredible OBT that you know them to be, threat posing and all, then they will become more terrestrial. But to call them a true fossorial is crazy. Let's now talk about humidity. Based on the GBIF, which is a global data center of essentially all of the biodiversity in certain locations, the locations that we described in the last segment around their locale, which is everything from Angola down to the southern South Africa, the humidity range is between 50 to 80%, and the temperature range is pretty wild depending on where it's at. And since most of the the Pterinochilus murinus are found on the equatorial line, you can anticipate that these are a pretty high temperature species. However, I'm going to talk more about how we keep them, just because at the end of the day, these are not in, sub-Sahara Africa. These are in your house. So we tend to keep them here, and we've been relatively successful. We've had about 650 of these over the time that we've been breeding them. We keep them between 73 degrees in the wintertime and 78 degrees in the summertime. Our humidity range is between 50% and about 65%. It's very crucial that you don't get these guys too wet. While they are able to withstand a lot of humidity, and they do require some humidity, it's just not ideal for them to be just like wet substrate and soaked. It's a pretty easy way to kill these guys. What we do is we overfill their water dish for about 3 seconds. We do wet down some sphagnum moss in one corner of their enclosure, and we do have a consistent water dish for them. I will occasionally drip some water into their web, but they don't really seem to care too much about that, or maybe they're just hiding and they come back later. It's just important to note that these are an African species, and therefore it's not ideal to get them soaked. but because of the massive distribution range they have, there's a lot of like give and take in terms of what they're allowing for humidity. But again, this is just my opinion. This is how I've been raising them. Do more research on this as far as I'm concerned, because I'm not going to go to the intricacies on what half a continent is ultimately doing on the humidity side. Next, let's talk about longevity. Longevity for these guys is pretty good. It's not the most phenomenal thing. It's not like a Brachypelma where you're going to be enjoying them for 35 years. But you're talking about for the males 3 to 4 years, the females anywhere between 10 to 15 years. It's honestly a pretty good and long amount of time. The reason this doesn't feel that good in terms of like, oh, I want my tarantula to last a long time, you're going to enjoy this tarantula, and we're going to talk more about this in the pros and cons, but you're going to thoroughly get your money's worth when it comes to having this tarantula, and we'll talk more about this later. Next, let's talk about fecundity. Fecundity, they have about 100 to 125 babies in my experience. In the last 2 egg sacs we had about that. They are quite fecund, but not as much as other species. It's really good though. If you're a breeder and you decide to start breeding these, you really don't want more than this. The reason being is when you begin to separate them as slings, guess what? They're an old world. They're really fast. So if this is your first time breeding an old world species like it was mine when I bred these, you're really going to be happy they only have about 100 to 100, and I think it was 117 is what we ended up total for the first one, and about 115 in the second. So it's really crucial that you don't want 500 of these at a time at the end of the day. Now let's get into that sexy, sexy pros and cons list. This is where we can stop worrying about the facts and we can just talk about feelings. God, I hated that. Let's talk about pros. The pros of this species are freaking awesome. They're so awesome. They're bright orange, and even the females, while they are slightly tame on the coloration, they are still beautiful. This beautiful species, whether you've got the dark color form, the normal color form, the Usambara, they're all equally dope. They're beautiful, and they're just a very cool tarantula. Another pro, that threat posing thing, which we're going to talk about more in the pros than the cons. It's pretty dope. And the problem with a lot of people is they're messing with them in videos and then claiming that they're a bitey tarantula. You know why they're bitey like that? Remember the distribution range I just talked about earlier? Do you know how much freaking biodiversity is in Africa, especially in that massive range I just gave you? So you know what this spider did? It evolved the ability to fight back. It's more flighty than bitey, but if you piss it off, it is going to make sure that you regret that decision. Are you a bird trying to eat them? I hope you realize what you are preparing yourself for as you swoop down to take a bite of this delicious orange cakey looking tarantula. Why do you think it's bright orange? Do you think it cares if you try to take a bite of it? It's going to make you regret that decision. It's a dope species. Another pro, that speed is incredible. The first time that I actually got one of these spiders, I had only had a curly hair before I got my OBT. And that OBT booked it from the cup, up the enclosure, back the enclosure, across the enclosure, and back to the front before I could blink. Another pro, I'm going back to the cool little bitey thing. I don't care what you say. These guys choose flight over fight, but if they choose fight, you better be prepared to deal with that. My gravid female was a sweetheart. Or she's still alive. She's a sweetheart. And the first time I tried to rehouse her when she was gravid, she ran up my tongs and almost bit me in the face, and it was 100% my fault. And now you might be thinking, Juice, that seems like not a pro. That is a pro, because you know what? I want a spider that when I'm upsetting it, I know exactly where I stand. I don't want a spider that's going to just be chill like some New Worlds and all of a sudden bite my paintbrush out of freaking nowhere. The OBT, it's going to tell you exactly where you stand in this interaction, and it's freaking awesome. And last but not least, when it comes to the OBT, it is one of the most affordable old worlds. They are They are so affordable. You can get them for basically pennies. And before some European comes over here, and when I tell you what I typically can sell them for or get them for, we get it. You get things for cheaper. You don't have to keep telling us it's a different market. You normally can get an OBT sling for anywhere between $8 to $30 maximum. This is let's say $50 if someone is absolutely selling them for a crazy price. You were talking $50 of a 10 to 15 year commitment that is every time you feed them is going to be incredible. Drop a roach in, guess what? It's going to threat pose that roach. Why? You don't know. That's called excitement. We're spicing your life up over here at Juice's Arthropods, and we think you're going to freaking love these guys. Let's talk about cons. Now, the cons are limited, but they bug the shit out of me, so we're going to talk about them. Number one, remember we talked about enclosures? Did you set them up in a weird arboreal setup, like you've rigged it, and it's just like, hey, I want to kind of encompass all those things? It won't care. It's going to do it at once, and it's going to put it wherever. Put it in fossorial, it's doing it in arboreal. Do you do it in terrestrial? It's doing it fossorial. It doesn't care what you want to do. No matter how much fancy branches or beautiful enclosure stuff you put in there, it's going to web the crap out of it and never use it and go put its entire home in a different corner that you didn't anticipate. The OBT is, without a doubt, not even opinion, an expert opinion, the worst interior designer you have ever seen when it comes to tarantulas. It will go in the top left corner of your enclosure. Why? Who knows? It just does what the hell it wants, and what are you going to do about it? It's just a mouthful of venom that you're really not going to be able to stop at what it's doing. So that's a con, is that it sucks where it puts its placement of anything. You decide, hey, I'm going to put some cork bark over here, and I'm going to make it fancy. I'm going to put some sphagnum moss, and then it's going to make its enclosure inside the sphagnum moss. It's an irritating interior decorator is my con number one. Con number two, you've bought this thing. Now you have to rehouse this thing. Remember how I told you they're flighty over bitey? That's a fact. Remember how I told you they are light speed? That's a fact. You have to get this just absolutely gorgeous tangerine monster inside of an enclosure while it's either trying to threat pose you or it's trying to flee from you. And sometimes it'll do both. Sometimes it'll flee and then stop mid-flee to threat pose you. It's adorable. I love it. But it's kind of a pain in the ass when you're trying to rehouse these things. Also, does it really like the current home it's in and you're trying to upgrade the enclosure? Sometimes it comes out with hate in its heart and it just wants to bite you. So all I'm telling you is that be very careful with the OBT when you go to rehouse it. That's a con. You don't know what you're going to get until it comes blasting out of that hole. So I'm just kind of preparing you for that. Last but not least, when it comes to cons of OBTs, I know of at least one person that's going to dislike this opinion. Mature male OBTs are absolute jackasses. They are situationally the worst. A mature female OBT, she is not afraid of you. If she doesn't want you nearby, and well, I mean, if you're coming at it from above, it thinks you're a bird and it's going to try to bite you. But she most of the time is not going to do much. She's going to be pretty chill. I can't even count on like two hands how often mature male OBTs just come out hot every time. They're just lunatics. Remember when I showed you up here about Somapoius ermenia and I said that I hate the males? I hate the males of the OBTs worse. They're just chaos goblins. Whatever you are hoping they'll do, they won't. They will be the opposite of that. And then if you're a breeder and you decide to pair these, there's another problem that you're going to have that I'm going to encompass part of this chaos goblin piece. The males are stupid, like really stupid. The females will sometimes lure them into their burrows and then try to eat them. And the males, having already paired with the female, rather than try to flee for their life, will follow into that burrow. So sometimes you lose a male because they're really dumb and they're just chaos incarnate. In conclusion, and of course all of this is my opinion, if what you want in a tarantula is a just beautiful, incredibly fast, wonderful old world tarantula, arguably in my top 3 species, and arguably one of my favorite starter old worlds, which I will go to the grave on, that is extremely underrated, extremely overhyped up for its ability to threat pose, and just truly a wonderful, wonderful pet. Then get an OBT. But if you're afraid of a spider that's bearing some fangs at you, stay away from tarantulas in general. That's my opinion. And remember, Arthur people, stay safe, stay educated, and most importantly, stay classy.